In the heart of the great Smoky Mountains, where mist clings to the ancient trees, and the air is thick with the weight of untold stories, lies a land steeped in both beauty and terror. For centuries, the Cherokee people lived in harmony with these mountains, but their tales speak of forces that defy understanding, spirits and creatures that stalk the dark woods, forever lingering on the edges of human perception. From ravenous witches to vengeful giants, the Smoky Mountains are more than just a natural wonder. They are a gateway to the unknown. As we journey into these chilling legends, we will encounter the terrifying myths that have haunted the Cherokee people for generations. These stories are not merely folklore. They are warnings, etched into the soul of the land. Enter, if you dare, into the horrors of the Smoky Mountains. Story 1. The Raven Mocker. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a chill that seemed unnatural for the season. Summer was coming to an end, but in the Smoky Mountains the crispness of fall had yet to fully settle. The moon was nearly full, casting a silvery glow over the cabin where old Isaac sat alone. His bones ached more than usual, a dull pain that seemed to settle deep within his joints. For days now he had felt something looming in the air, a weight pressing down on him that he couldn't shake. The Cherokee elders used to speak of such things, a sense that something terrible was on the horizon. Isaac had lived in these mountains his whole life. He had learned from the Cherokee people who remained in these lands even after their forced removal, listened to their stories, and respected their ancient wisdom. But one story had always haunted him more than the rest: the tale of the Raven Mocker. According to legend, the Raven Mocker, or Kalanuakielu, was a malevolent spirit that preyed on the dying. It would visit those on the edge of death, invisible to most, and steal their remaining years of life. As it did so, the victim's body would age rapidly, and when they finally died, they would appear decades older than they truly were. The Raven Mocker was feared above all other spirits because it did not only take life, it took time itself, robbing families of their loved ones long before their natural end. Isaac tried to shake off the thought, but the uneasy feeling clung to him. For weeks now, his health had been declining. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said it was simply the way of things when one reached his age. But Isaac wasn't convinced. He had always been strong, a hunter in his younger days, a man of the land. This sudden weakness didn't feel right. Something else was happening. As night fell and the cabin grew darker, Isaac heard the sound of wings outside his window. At first he thought it was just a bird passing by, maybe an owl. But then the sound came again, closer this time. The flapping was slow, deliberate, and far too loud to be any ordinary bird. His heart raced. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him like a shadow. Could it be the Raven Mocker? Isaac's mind flashed back to the old stories, the warnings given by the elders. The Raven Mocker was drawn to the weak, the sick, those on the brink of death. It came in the night, invisible except to those with strong medicine, and it fed on the dying. No one saw it until it was too late, except for the medicine men, who could sometimes sense its presence and drive it away. Isaac sat up in bed, clutching his blanket. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder. His breath came out in soft clouds, though it wasn't cold enough for that. He strained his ears, listening. The wings flapped again, now circling his cabin. He could feel it, the presence of something old, something evil. A knock at the door startled him, making his heart skip a beat. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at this hour. Slowly, he rose from his bed, his legs trembling beneath him. He opened the door cautiously, expecting to see someone from the village. But no one was there. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest. His vision blurred for a moment, and he felt the weight of something oppressive in the air. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, with long, shadowy wings that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The Raven Mocker. Panic surged through him, but his legs refused to move. The figure remained still, watching. Then it took a step forward, and as it did, Isaac felt his strength leave him. He gasped for air, clutching his chest. His body ached, and his skin felt tight as though it were aging before his very eyes. Suddenly, the door behind him swung open and a gust of wind rushed in. Standing there was a medicine man from the nearby village, his face stern, painted with sacred markings. He had come, drawn by the whispers of the wind, sensing that death was near. Without a word, the medicine man began chanting, waving a bundle of sage, filling the cabin with the thick protective smoke. The raven mocker hesitated, its wings fluttering in agitation. It screeched, a high-pitched sound that pierced the night air, then retreated back into the shadows of the trees. Isaac collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. He was alive for now, but he could still feel the icy grip of the raven mocker on his soul. The medicine man knelt beside him, his voice low but steady. "It will return," he said, "but we will be ready." Story 2. Tsul Kalu's Return. Deep in the Smoky Mountains, there are places that people avoid, places where the shadows are darker, the trees thicker, and the air feels heavy with an ancient presence. Tzali knew these places well. As a boy, he had often wandered the mountains, following game trails and listening to the stories his grandfather told him by the fire at night. The most terrifying of these stories was the one about Tsul Kalu, the slant-eyed giant. Tsul Kalu, the Cherokee devil, was said to be a monstrous being who roamed the mountains, watching over his domain with malevolent intent. He was no ordinary giant. His eyes were slanted and unnaturally large, giving him an otherworldly appearance. His strength was unmatched, and his ability to blend into the wilderness made him nearly invisible. The legend said that Tsul Kalu had once been the protector of these mountains, but after being disrespected by humans, he turned against them, becoming a figure of terror. Tzali had always dismissed the story as just that, a story. He was a hunter, a man of the modern world, and he had never seen anything in the mountains that couldn't be explained by logic. But that all changed one autumn afternoon. It began with the tracks. Tzali had been following a deer trail when he noticed something unusual. The footprints were too large to be from any animal he knew of, and they were spaced far apart, as if made by something with an enormous stride. He knelt down, examining them closely. The prints were deep, too deep for a bear, and they had a strange shape, almost human, but not quite. His heart quickened. He had heard tales of these tracks, spoken of only in whispers. Without thinking, he followed them, curiosity and a strange sense of dread pulling him deeper into the woods. The trail led him through a part of the mountains he had never explored, a place where the trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches blocking out the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the forest fell eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Tzali's instincts told him to turn back, but something else, a strange compulsion, kept him moving forward. As he followed the trail, he began to notice other signs. Claw marks on trees too high up for any bear, strange symbols etched into the bark, and the unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. Hours passed, and the daylight began to fade. He knew he should return to his village, but the tracks continued, leading him to a cliffside he had never seen before. The rocks here were smooth, as though worn down by centuries of something brushing against them. And then he saw it, carved into the stone, a massive handprint, too large to be human. Tsul Kalu. A low rumble echoed through the mountains and Tzali froze. The ground beneath him trembled, and from the shadows of the forest something enormous began to stir. His heart pounded as the stories of Tsul Kalu flooded his mind. The giant was said to be able to command the very earth, bending it to his will. And now, it seemed, he was awake. Tzali backed away slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The rumbling grew louder, and then, from the forest, the giant emerged. Tsul Kalu was exactly as the legends described, taller than any man. His skin the color of stone, his eyes narrow and filled with rage. He moved with a grace that belied his size, each step shaking the ground beneath him. Tzali's breath caught in his throat. He had no weapons powerful enough to fight such a creature. All he could do was run. He turned and bolted through the trees, his legs pumping with adrenaline, but the ground beneath him buckled as Tsul Kalu gave chase. Trees bent and snapped as the giant pursued him, his massive hands reaching for Tzali as he darted through the forest. In a last-ditch effort, Solly sprinted toward a rocky outcrop where his ancestors were said to have once performed sacred rituals. He remembered his grandfather's stories of how the old ways could protect against the Cherokee devil. With the giant closing in, Solly began to chant, the words of the old language spilling from his lips in desperation. Suddenly, the earth beneath him stopped shaking. The air grew still, and when Solly looked back, Tzulkalu had stopped at the edge of the outcrop, his slanted eyes burning with fury but unable to step forward. The ancient magic of the land held him at bay. For now. But as Solly retreated, he knew one thing for certain. Tzulkalu had returned, and he was no longer just a story. Story 3. Uktena, the Serpent of Fire. The Smoky Mountains had always held secrets, their misty peaks hiding ancient tales whispered only by the wind. For centuries, the Cherokee people had revered these mountains, believing them to be home to powerful spirits. Among these spirits, none was more feared or coveted than Uktena, the horned serpent of fire. Uktena was not just any serpent. It was said to be a creature of immense size, a dragon-like being with a blazing crest atop its head and scales that shimmered like molten gold. But it wasn't only Uktena's terrifying form that struck fear into the hearts of those who spoke of it. It was the fact that Uktena guarded treasures beyond imagination. Hidden deep within the caves and cliffs of the Smoky Mountains, the serpent's lair was said to be filled with gold, jewels, and the ageless knowledge of the ancients. Many had sought Uktena's treasure, but few had returned, and those who did came back empty-handed, their minds broken by the things they had seen. Jack had always been a skeptic. He wasn't Cherokee, but he had grown up hearing the legends. To him, the stories of Uktena were nothing more than tall tales spun by old-timers to scare children and tourists. But when he and his two friends, Marcus and Tom, stumbled upon an old map at a flea market in the nearby town, his curiosity was piqued. The map, weathered and torn, seemed to mark a hidden cave deep in the Smoky Mountains, with cryptic symbols that hinted at great treasure. The old man who sold it to them had muttered something about the serpent's curse, but Jack hadn't paid him much attention. Now standing at the edge of a narrow rocky trail that wound its way deeper into the heart of the mountains, Jack was beginning to feel a slight unease. The forest around them had grown quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were conspicuously absent, as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath. "You sure this is the place?" Marcus asked, peering at the crumpled map in Jack's hand. Jack nodded. "This is it. The entrance to the cave should be just ahead." He tried to sound confident, but the weight of the silence around them gnawed at his resolve. They pressed on, the forest thickening around them, the canopy of trees growing denser until it blocked out most of the sunlight. As they reached the location marked on the map, they found themselves standing before the entrance to a cave, its mouth wide and dark as though the mountain itself were swallowing all light and sound. A strange symbol was carved into the stone above the entrance, a spiral with two sharp horns protruding from it. It was a symbol Jack had seen before in books about Cherokee mythology, the mark of Uktena. Tom, the most superstitious of the group, hesitated. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We should turn back." Jack laughed, though the sound came out hollow. "It's just a cave. There's no such thing as Uktena. It's just a story, man. Come on, we've come this far." Despite his bravado, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air near the cave entrance felt unnaturally cold, and there was a faint smell of sulfur, sharp and acrid, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Still, the promise of treasure pushed him forward. They lit their flashlights and stepped into the cave. Inside, the walls were smooth, almost as if they had been polished over centuries. Strange, swirling patterns covered the stone, reminiscent of the symbol they had seen outside. The tunnel was narrow at first, forcing them to walk single file, but it soon opened up into a wide cavern, the ceiling high and lost in shadow. As they moved deeper into the cave, the sense of unease grew. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with a heavy, unnatural silence. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off the walls in strange patterns that made it sound as though someone, or something, was walking beside them. "Jack, are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the far side of the cavern, where the faint glimmer of something metallic caught his eye. He quickened his pace, ignoring the growing sense of dread that clawed at his chest. As they drew closer, the glimmer resolved into piles of gold and jewels, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Ancient artifacts, daggers, shields, and pottery lay among the treasure, their surfaces dulled by time. "Holy, this is real," Marcus breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. Tom, too, was speechless, his fear momentarily forgotten as he stared at the fortune before them. Jack dropped to his knees, greed overtaking him as he began scooping handfuls of gold coins into his backpack. He could hardly believe it. After years of doubting the stories, here it was, the treasure of Uktena, lying unclaimed in the belly of the mountain. But as he reached for a particularly large gemstone, something strange happened. The cavern seemed to tremble. At first it was subtle, a faint vibration beneath their feet. But soon, the shaking grew more intense, as though the very ground was awakening from a long slumber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the air grew even colder. A low, guttural hiss echoed through the cave, so deep it felt as if it was coming from the earth itself. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered, his face pale. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shifted violently. From the far end of the cave, something massive stirred in the shadows. Jack froze, his hands still clutching the gold, as a shape began to emerge from the darkness. A shape so enormous and so terrifying that for a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. Uktena. The stories hadn't done it justice. The serpent was impossibly large, its coiled body stretching the length of the cavern. Its scales shimmered with a sickly golden glow, reflecting the light from their flashlights like fire. Atop its head, two sharp curved horns jutted out, and from its forehead a single blazing red gem pulsed with an eerie light. Its eyes, slitted and burning, locked onto them, filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The creature's body uncoiled with a smooth, predatory grace, and its head rose higher, towering above them. It hissed again, the sound reverberating through the cave like a thunderclap, and the ground shook beneath their feet. Panic overtook them. "Run!" Jack shouted, dropping the gold and scrambling to his feet. The three of them bolted toward the cave entrance, their flashlights swinging wildly as they sprinted through the darkness. Behind them, the serpent moved, its massive body slithering over the treasure with terrifying speed. The ground trembled with each movement of its immense form, and the hiss of its breath filled the air, growing louder, closer. Jack's lungs burned as he ran, the sharp rocks of the cave floor cutting into his shoes. He could hear the others panting beside him, their footsteps frantic and uneven. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, the exit farther away with every step. He glanced over his shoulder, and his heart nearly stopped. Uktena was gaining on them. Its mouth was open wide, revealing rows of gleaming, razor-sharp teeth. The fiery gem on its forehead glowed brighter, casting the cavern in an eerie red light. It was as though the serpent was drawing power from the treasure itself, growing stronger, faster with every second. Just when it seemed like they would never escape, the mouth of the cave came into view, a small circle of light far ahead. Jack's muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to run faster. Marcus was just ahead of him, Tom close behind when the ground gave a violent lurch. Tom stumbled, falling hard to the ground with a cry. "Tom!" Marcus shouted, but there was no time to go back. Uktena was almost upon them. Tom looked up, his eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing he could do. The serpent's massive head descended upon him with lightning speed, its jaws snapping shut with a bone-chilling crunch. The sound echoed through the cavern, followed by a sickening silence. Jack and Marcus didn't stop. They reached the cave entrance and stumbled out into the forest, gasping for air. The sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the cave, but they didn't dare look back. They kept running deeper into the woods until they could no longer hear the serpent's hissing or feel the tremors beneath their feet. When they finally stopped, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion, Jack looked at Marcus. His friend's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. They were alive, but Tom was gone, and so was the treasure. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The mountain loomed behind them, silent, and foreboding, as though it had swallowed their friend whole. "We should have listened," Marcus said finally, his voice hollow. "The stories, they were true." Jack didn't respond. He knew Marcus was right. Uktena wasn't just a legend, it was real, and its curse was far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The treasure had been nothing but a lure, a trap for those foolish enough to seek it out. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest, Jack made a silent vow. He would never speak of what had happened in that cave. The legend of Uktena would remain just that, a story. But deep down he knew that the serpent was still out there, guarding its hoard, waiting for the next fool to come seeking its cursed riches. And this time, Jack would make sure that fool wasn't him. Story 4. Spearfinger's Curse. In the quiet, shadowed valleys of the Smoky Mountains, there are stories that parents tell their children to keep them safe. Stories of old evils that wander the woods. One such tale passed down from generation to generation among the Cherokee people is the story of Spearfinger, the witch with a heart of stone and a hand as sharp as a blade. It is said that Spearfinger could take the form of anyone she wished, luring her victims into a false sense of security before striking. But what she desired most was the livers of children, her twisted hunger driving her to roam the mountains in search of the innocent. She had lived for centuries, her power tied to the stone heart she carried within her chest, making her nearly impossible to kill. Emma hadn't thought much about the old stories. She had grown up in these mountains, just like her mother and grandmother before her, and though she respected the traditions of her Cherokee ancestors, she had never truly believed in the tales of witches and monsters. But that was before strange things began happening around her home. That was before Spearfinger came for her daughter. It started innocently enough with whispers on the wind. Emma's small homestead was nestled deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, and she loved the solitude it offered. She lived there with her young daughter Lily, who had just turned 6. The woods were their playground, a place of endless adventure and discovery. But lately, Lily had started talking about a new friend she had made, a woman who visited her in the woods. At first, Emma had dismissed it as a child's imagination. Lily often made up elaborate stories, talking to imaginary friends as she played among the trees. But as the days passed, something about the way Lily described this woman made Emma uneasy. "She's so nice, Mama," Lily had said one evening, her bright eyes shining as she spoke. "She tells me stories and she knows all the animals. She says she used to live here a long, long time ago." Emma had paused, a frown tugging at her lips. What does she look like? Lily had smiled, her small fingers twirling in her hair. "Oh, she's really old, but she doesn't act old. She's got long gray hair and her hand is funny. She always hides it behind her back, but I saw it once. It looks like a big pointy stone." A chill crept down Emma's spine at those words, though she couldn't explain why. She tried to dismiss the feeling, reminding herself that children often exaggerated or misremembered things. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the strange sense of foreboding that had settled over her. The next morning, Emma told Lily to stay close to the house and not wander into the woods. Lily pouted but eventually agreed, spending the day playing in the yard with her toys. Still, Emma couldn't relax. Every time she glanced toward the tree line, she felt as though something was watching them from the shadows. That evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Lily wandered over to the porch where Emma was sitting. "She says I can go with her soon," Lily said, her voice dreamy, as though she were speaking of some wonderful adventure. Emma stiffened. "Who says that, sweetheart?" "My friend from the woods," Lily replied, her eyes distant. "She says she'll take me somewhere special. She says I don't need to tell you, but I wanted to." Fear clawed at Emma's throat. She knelt down in front of her daughter, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "Lily, listen to me. You can't go anywhere with her. Do you understand? You must stay away from her no matter what she says." Lily blinked, confusion clouding her face. "But she's nice, Mama. She wouldn't hurt me." Emma's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. "Promise me, Lily. Promise you won't go with her." Reluctantly, Lily nodded. "I promise." That night, Emma hardly slept. She kept hearing strange noises outside, branches snapping, the soft rustle of leaves, and more than once, the faintest echo of a woman's voice calling from the woods. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down she knew something was wrong. The next morning, Lily was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through Emma as she tore through the house, calling her daughter's name. The yard was empty and the woods loomed dark and silent beyond the tree line. She ran into the forest, her heart pounding in her chest, her throat raw from shouting. "Lily!" she screamed. "Lily, where are you?" For hours she searched, her desperation growing with each passing moment. And then, just as the sun began to set, she heard it, the soft giggle of a child, coming from deep within the forest. Emma ran toward the sound, her legs burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst into a small clearing, and there, standing at the edge of a cliff, was Lily. But she wasn't alone. Beside her was an old woman, her long gray hair flowing down her back, her face twisted into a smile that sent shivers down Emma's spine. The woman held Lily's hand, her other hand hidden behind her back. Emma froze, her heart lurching in her chest. "Lily!" she cried, her voice shaking. Lily turned, her innocent face lighting up when she saw her mother. "Mama, look! My friend brought me here to show me something special." The old woman's smile widened, and she stepped forward, pulling Lily closer. Emma's eyes locked on the woman's hidden hand, dread creeping through her veins. The woman's arm shifted, and for the briefest moment Emma caught a glimpse of it, a hand made of stone, sharp and glistening like a spear. Spearfinger. The stories flooded back to her, the tales of the shape-shifting witch who preyed on children, who lured them away with false kindness, and whose stone hand could pierce flesh as easily as air. Emma's blood turned to ice. She had heard these stories her whole life, but never believed they could be real. Now standing in the clearing with her daughter inches from the witch's grasp, the full horror of the truth crashed down on her. Without thinking, Emma lunged forward, her hand outstretched. "Get away from her!" she screamed, her voice filled with terror and rage. Spearfinger's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing into slits. She let go of Lily's hand and stepped back, her stone finger rising threateningly. Emma grabbed her daughter and pulled her close, backing away as the witch advanced. "You cannot stop me, Mother," Spearfinger hissed, her voice like the grinding of stones. "I will take what is mine." Emma's heart raced as she held Lily tight, her mind scrambling for anything she could use to protect her child. Spearfinger was nearly invincible, according to the legends. Her stone heart made her impossible to kill by ordinary means. But there was one weakness. Her heart had to be shattered by a weapon crafted of the mountain's own stone, forged by a medicine man skilled in the old ways. Emma had neither time nor such a weapon, but she had something else. Desperation. As Spearfinger moved toward them, Emma grabbed a large rock from the ground and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the witch in the chest, but the stone merely bounced off harmlessly, as though it had hit a statue. Spearfinger laughed, her voice cold and cruel. "You cannot harm me, she is mine." Emma's pulse roared in her ears as she held Lily tighter. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear but also with determination. "You won't take her." Spearfinger lunged, her stone finger aimed straight for Emma's heart, but at the last moment, Emma threw herself to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly strike. Spearfinger staggered forward, off balance, and Emma seized the opportunity. She grabbed another rock and smashed it into the back of the witch's head with every ounce of strength she had. The blow sent Spearfinger reeling, her form flickering for a moment as though she were losing control of her disguise. She let out a furious scream, the sound tearing through the forest, shaking the very ground beneath them. For a moment, Emma thought she had won. But then Spearfinger straightened, her face contorted with rage. "You will pay for this," she snarled, raising her stone hand high. "Both of you." Before she could strike, the ground beneath Spearfinger trembled. A loud crack echoed through the clearing, and the edge of the cliff where the witch stood began to crumble. Spearfinger's eyes widened in shock as the earth gave way beneath her feet. and with one final ear-splitting scream, she plunged into the dark abyss below. Emma stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her arms still wrapped protectively around Lily. The forest was silent once more, as though the very land itself had expelled the evil that had lingered there for so long. Lily clung to her mother, her small body trembling. "Mama," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Was she a bad person?" Emma looked down at her daughter, her heart still racing, but she forced a smile. "She's gone now, sweetheart. She can't hurt us anymore." But as they made their way back through the forest, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Spearfinger had fallen, but the stories always said she could return, her stone heart unbroken, her hunger for children's livers still unquenched. Sad. Emma only hoped that the mountain would keep the witch trapped in its depths for a long, long time. Story 5. The Ghosts of Cataloochee Valley. Cataloochee Valley lay hidden within the folds of the Great Smoky Mountains, a forgotten place, shrouded in mist and silence. Once, long ago, the valley had been a thriving settlement for the Cherokee, a place filled with life, laughter, and the rhythms of daily existence. But now it was abandoned, haunted only by the whispering wind and the ghosts of those who had lived there. James was a Cherokee historian, dedicated to preserving the stories of his ancestors, stories that had been slowly fading with time. He had spent years researching the lost villages of the Smoky Mountains, the places where his people had once lived before they were driven from their lands. Cataloochee Valley had always fascinated him, not just because of its historical significance, but because of the eerie tales that surrounded it. The valley was said to be cursed, a place where the spirits of the dead still wandered, trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. Despite the warnings from the elders, James decided to go. He wanted to record the stories, to find the burial sites of those who had lived in the valley, and perhaps to connect with the spirits himself. He believed that by honoring them, he could help them find the rest they deserved. The journey into Cataloochee was long and arduous. James hiked for hours through dense forests, crossing creeks and climbing steep, rocky trails. As he neared the valley, the forest seemed to grow thicker, the trees looming larger, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. A thick fog hung low in the air, wrapping around the trunks of the trees like a shroud. By the time James reached the valley, the sun was already setting. The fog had deepened, casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape. The valley stretched out before him, vast and empty, the ruins of old homesteads scattered across the fields like forgotten memories. The air was still, unnaturally so, and the only sound was the distant rush of a stream somewhere in the distance. James set up camp near one of the old homesteads, a crumbling cabin that had long since been overtaken by the forest. He had brought a small tent, but as he unpacked his gear, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was a feeling that grew stronger with each passing minute. The air was thick with tension, as though the valley itself was waiting, watching, preparing for something. That night, James sat by his campfire, listening to the crackling of the flames and the distant calls of the night birds. The fog swirled around him, making the world beyond the firelight seem hazy and dreamlike. He had brought his journal with him, intending to record his thoughts and findings, but his mind kept wandering back to the stories of Cataloochee, the stories of the ghosts. The Cherokee people believed that the spirits of the dead could become trapped in places where they had experienced great pain or suffering. Some said that the valley had seen too much sorrow, too many lives lost, too many people forced from their homes. The spirits that remained there were restless, angry, their souls caught in an endless loop, unable to move on. James had heard these stories his entire life, but he had never believed them. Until that night. It started with a whisper, soft at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. James thought it was the wind, a gust moving through the trees. But then he heard it again, closer this time. A voice, indistinct, as if carried on the breeze, calling his name. "James!" He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was faint but unmistakable. He stood up, turning in a slow circle, scanning the fog-shrouded landscape for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. only the dark shapes of the trees, the crumbling homestead, and the heavy fog that clung to the earth like a veil. "James." The voice came again, closer now, insistent. His blood ran cold. It sounded like a woman, her tone soft but filled with a sense of urgency. For a moment he wondered if he was imagining it. He had been alone in the valley for hours, his mind wandering as the fog played tricks on his senses. But the voice was real. He knew it. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking slightly. There was no response, only the whispering of the wind through the trees. James tried to calm himself, telling himself that it was just the isolation getting to him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The air around him felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling in unnatural patterns around his campsite. He stepped closer to the edge of the firelight, peering into the darkness. That's when he saw her. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the fog. But as James squinted, the figure became clearer. A woman, dressed in traditional Cherokee clothing, stood at the edge of the clearing. Her hair was long and dark, falling over her shoulders in loose waves. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark, filled with sorrow. "James," she whispered again, her voice floating on the wind. "You have to leave." James stared, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman's eyes were fixed on him, filled with a sadness so deep that it seemed to seep into his bones. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his mind racing. "You have to leave," she repeated, her voice trembling with urgency. "It's not safe here." Before James could respond, the woman turned and began walking toward the trees, her figure dissolving into the mist. For a moment he stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to pack up and leave, to get out of the valley before it was too late. But another part of him, the part that had brought him here in the first place, felt compelled to follow her. Grabbing his flashlight, James hurried after the woman, his boots crunching softly on the damp ground. The fog seemed to close in around him, thick and suffocating. But he pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the fading shape of the woman ahead of him. She led him deeper into the valley, past the ruins of old cabins and overgrown fields. The further they went, the more James felt the weight of the valley pressing down on him. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the soft sound of his own breathing and the faint whisper of the woman's footsteps ahead. Finally, she stopped at the edge of a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching up toward the sky like skeletal arms. The woman turned to face him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "They're trapped here," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They've been here for so long. Too long." James frowned, stepping closer. "Who? Who's trapped?" "The spirits," she replied, her voice trembling. "The ones who died here. The ones who were forced from their homes. They can't move on. They're lost." James's heart ached at the sadness in her voice. He had come to the valley to honor the spirits, to remember those who had lived and died there. But now, standing in the clearing, he realized that the stories were true. The ghosts of Catalucci were real and they were suffering. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How can I help them?" The woman's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hope in her gaze. "You must honor them," she said. "You must remember them, but you must leave this place. It is not for the living." James nodded slowly, his heart heavy. He wanted to help, but he knew that the valley was not a place for the living. It was a place for the dead, a place where the spirits of his ancestors lingered, waiting for someone to remember them. As the woman turned and began to fade into the mist once more, James felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had come to Catalucci to find the past, to connect with his ancestors, and though the experience had been terrifying, he knew that he had found what he was looking for. The valley was a place of sorrow, a place where the past and present collided in an endless loop. But it was also a place of memory, a place where the spirits of the dead could be honored and remembered. As James made his way back to his campsite, the fog began to lift, and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. He packed up his things in silence, his mind still reeling from the night's events. As he hiked out of the valley, he couldn't help but glance back one last time. The mist still clung to the earth, and the ruins of the old homestead stood in silent testimony to the lives that had once flourished there. But now James understood that the valley was more than just a forgotten place. It was a resting ground for the lost souls who had called it home. And though the ghosts of Catalucci would never leave, they would be remembered.